I do want to welcome you all this evening to our second Nicholson lecture for 2024. My name is Heather McCann, I serve as president here at Atlantic School of Theology. AST is located in Mi'kma'ki, the traditional and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Beginning in 1725, the Mi'kmaq, along with the Wolastoqiyik and Passamaquoddy, signed a series of peace and friendship treaties with the British Crown. These treaties did not deal with surrender of land, but rather established the conditions for sharing resources in this place. We are grateful to the Mi'kmaq for their hospitality and their stewardship of these lands from time immemorial, which allows us to be here to learn, to worship, and to serve. Would you join me in prayer? Holy One, we give you thanks for the gifts of this day and for the privilege of being able to be together this evening in person and in this virtual space, to learn, to seek to expand our hearts, minds, and souls, to seek to become better stewards of this creation with which you have entrusted us. We ask your blessing upon our speaker, Pam. Bless her words, open our minds. In Christ's name, amen. Amen. For our second of two evenings, if you missed last night, you missed a really good one. It will be on the AST YouTube channel. Dr. Pamela McCarroll, sorry, I did that last night too. Dr. Pamela McCarroll serves as the Jane and Geoffrey Martin Chair in Practical Theology and also as Dean at Emmanuel College, which is part of Victoria University and also part of the Toronto School of Theology and also part of the University of Toronto. She joined the faculty at Emmanuel College in 2016 after teaching in the area of pastoral theology for several years at Knox College, and prior to that serving as a spiritual care educator and director at hospitals in Toronto and Hamilton. Pam's major research and teaching focus has been on the lived experience and possibility of hope in contexts of suffering. She is concerned with the intersections of suffering and hope in shaping healing practices and life together as communities and global citizens. Recently, her research focuses on the climate crisis and practical theology. She is recognized for her leadership in the field. She also teaches and publishes on interreligious spiritual care and chaplaincy, spirituality and health, interreligious spiritual care education, and methodology in practical theology. We are in for a real treat tonight. Dr. McCarroll.
Thank you, President McCann. And thank you all and for the incredible hospitality of the last couple of days. I want to particularly name Dylan over here. Thank you for doing the tech. President McCann and also Dean McAlpine-Gillis, who isn't able to be with us tonight, and Rob Fennell and Sally Shaw, Kevin Parks, who I was in touch with through this process, and James Cheatley and Lydia Hood and Dave Sinos. Also want to acknowledge the Nicholson family who created this endowed lectureship. And as I'm learning more about, I guess, Principal or President Nicholson, President, yeah, really, really wonderful to hear these stories about him. So from last night, I was pondering a lot of things afterwards, and there's only so much that can be said. And one of the things that really struck me that I just wanted to name before we get started today is just how much we're living in this context of this sort of neoliberal capitalist order and the system within which we find ourselves and function, right? And how that is really built on the backs of the poor, but also in terms of the using the earth as kind of a commodity or as resources to serve humans, right? And the whole way of seeing the image of the human, which last night I was talking about the challenge with that, the call to be, tenders and keepers of the earth, right? Or reflectors of God's goodness and love. But the image of the human that drives really that kind of neoliberal capitalist order is that of consumer, right? This idea of consuming. And Alita and I were talking earlier how that kind of metaphor, it's very formational. It forms us in a certain way because it's messaged all the time, right? And so part of leaning into a different vision is trying to resist that kind of falling into being human as consumer, but also leaning into something at this sort of sense of tender and keeper of the earth, and also this mirroring the divine love. At least those are two motifs to work with. So because this whole consumer culture that sets up goals for human life in all sorts of distorted ways is dependent on the depletion, really, of the earth, and it's so unsustainable. So my hope is through practices that we can find our way back home, in a sense, home with the earth and as part of the earth. I think also I was aware of a feeling toward the end of the evening, just the need to do more and do more and do more and do more, right? Which can be very heavy and overwhelming, because part of what a lot of us experience now is this sense of going, and how can we do more. And I think, again, that is very much shaped by this neoliberal capitalist order, this sense of doing more, being more, having more, everything more. And so trying to unhook us from that way of thinking, because it can be a way of trying to deal with our helplessness, the helplessness that we can feel in the face of the climate crisis and the big threat. So it kind of functions in a way, when we're talking about trauma reactions, it can function as that kind of way of getting ourselves up the hook. So it's great to do action, and I'm not against that, but just sort of want us to be gentle with ourselves on that, because I felt that kind of heaviness last night, and so I'm opening with that. I'll share with you what the plan is for the rest of the night. Oh, there we go. So we're going to just start with a little question. You can ponder now, what gives you hope? So just what gives you hope? If you just ask that, maybe a word that comes to mind. Then we'll go into some critiques of hope and why some people feel that it is not appropriate in this time, especially in the context of the climate crisis. And then lean into what might be some habits of hope. And I draw on the kind of, we talked last night about climate trauma and all of that stuff and the ways it can send us in all sorts of behaviors. This is using a kind of trauma recovery model to frame out the kinds of habits for hope that we can move toward. So, to begin with, when you hear this question, what gives you hope? What comes to your mind, or what image do you see? What gives you hope? Anything come to mind? Anybody want to say?
My grandchildren.
Your grandchildren, okay.
Say young children.
Young children, yeah.
I lived a number of years ago in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood in West Denver.
Yeah.
They had all kinds of people with numbers on their arms. And Holocaust survivors who lived with god awful things.
Right.
One man pulled his leg up one time and showed me after many years he had climbed over a fence and wire and split his shin.
Right.
Oh, he still had a scar. I look at people like that. Those people can somehow make it through.
Yeah.
Quite well.
Yeah.
Still do that for productive people.
Right.
Those people gave me.
Yes, a powerful symbol of hope, of resilience, of survival. Yeah.
Had a number on her arm. I don't know. I didn't ask. I never probe details.
Right.
But sometimes I got things anyway.
Yeah.
So.
Thank you. Yeah.
I just say expressions of kindness.
Expressions of kindness, right? Especially when they're unexpected. Like the person who saw me wanting to walk across the street today and just stopped in the middle of a busy street so I could walk across. Yeah. Anything else come to mind? Yeah.
A few years ago, I was on a hike behind York Redoubt. You may not know where that is, but most people will know.
On a hike, yes.
And there'd been a paved road had been there at one time.
Mm.
But as I walked along this remains of the road. It was broken up. And there was lots of growth coming up through it. And I thought, yeah, we think we can put down pavement and do what we think. We're not in charge.
Right, so the green coming up through the asphalt or whatever, yes, and, yeah, beautiful, yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for that, yes.
And small acts of kindness, seeing someone last week pay for someone's lunch
Ah.
because they were struggling
Right,
to get change
Right.
at the bottom of their purse. And
yeah,
someone just saying, hey, I'll get it.
right, yeah, thank you for that, yeah, so acts of kindness, often the kinds of things, when I ask that question in a lot of different contexts, the kinds of things that come forward are often relationships or, you know, the symbols of like children, these acts of kindness, spontaneous kinds of gifts of beauty, you know, and that we're given to see that actually feed hope, which I think is something to keep in mind when we think about how hope is often constructed. So let's hold that. And now we're going to go into a bit of a critique of hope and the way hope has been often constructed, especially in the West. Well, first of all, I'll share with you this. This isn't the one, she has some interesting quotes, Greta Thunberg, but you lied to us. You gave us false hope, right? You told us that the future was something to look forward to. And the saddest thing is that most children are not even aware of the fate that awaits us. We will not understand it until it's too late. And yet we are the lucky ones. Those who will be affected the hardest are already suffering the consequences, but their voices are not heard. So this is one of Greta Thunberg's critiques of hope, because this idea that, you know, it was lied, it's based on this idea that things will get better, and you promised us things will get better, and things aren't getting better. So it's a construction of hope, and she's saying it's false hope, because that idea, that's not the way for certainly her generation, and for most people around the world for a long time. So critiques of hope in the context of the crisis. This is a quote from Miguel de la Torre in his book Embracing Hopelessness, and he's a theological ethicist at Islet. Hope is what is fed to those who are being slaughtered so they won't fight what is coming. So this concern about hope being the thing that keeps people down and keeps people in their place so they won't act up, right? And that's been a critique of hope, especially how hope's been constructed in the modern West. Or hope, he also describes as malevolent forces can use hope to manipulate us, making us complicit to continued oppression. So it's so hope being this thing that if we hold on to this, we won't get stirred up, we won't get upset about what is, because, you know, we have hope for something else, and that will just keep us in our place. So he believes that often, Miguel de la Torre believes that living for this kind of days that we're living in, hope will lull Christians in particular into a kind of passivity that neglects to take, especially the earth seriously, as the place where God's goodness and gifts are visible and present. So, a critique of hope. So he says, embrace hopelessness. So he just wants to do away with the whole idea of hope. You know, love is okay, that's something else, but not hope. But you can see his construction of it is quite different than what you described your experience of hope is. So I want to hold that. So hope can be, some of the problems with hope is that it can be co-opted by this kind of acute stress, what we talked about last night, or trauma responses. So it can manifest a kind of fight or freeze response. So hope as optimism, the idea that everything's going to work out no matter what, sort of there's an inevitability that things are going to get better, right? So hope as optimism kind of generally feeds on that idea, assuming everything will work out no matter what. And then there's hope as hopium. So this is a word that's thrown around. It's a little bit referring to what the Dilatory mentioned, hopium. So keeping people down, just keeping them, this is hopium as in opium, keeping them deadened to what they need, what they want, you know, what the kind of oppression that is imprisoning them as a kind of escape from the world. And then there's this idea of false hope, which Greta Thunberg mentioned in the quote we read, that is more attached to an outcome or goal of a better future. It's very related to hope as optimism. And so you can see how these can reflect sort of the denial or the avoidance or, you know, of what's actually happening or facing the kind of dire reality of what's happening. So this is why there have been critiques of hope. And there are some critiques about hope as it functions in theology too, sometimes. So Brian McLaren, in the book I referenced last night, Life After Doom, refers to, you know, how hope can be this escape from the world based on otherworldly notions of the eschaton, of heaven, of the future, right? So hope as an escape from the earth. And in some constructions, and some Christian constructions of the religious right, we see this happening, the sort of denigration of the world and the earthenness, sort of saying that this doesn't matter, you know, drill, baby, drill, whatever, you know, because this old world is passing and a new world will come. So there are these constructions that are very problematic in terms of how hope can be understood. The idea of hope as optimism can move into some theological circles too, to sort of be, again, everything will work out, or God will take care of everything. You know, that is another way of sometimes it's what can settle us, right? At the same time, so it's not saying that there are nuances and distinctions in this, but to be aware of this idea of God will take care of everything and we don't need to concern ourselves with the earth, you know, can be a way of distancing from our own responsibility for the earth. So it can be a way of copping out. And then hope as human mastery of the earth to build the best of all possible worlds, God being our helper. I put that sort of in quotes. And that would have been a kind of underlying operative theology of some of the early 20th century kind of particularly mainline denominations in North America might have some of that way of thinking that we're going to create this and we are God's hand, and it leads to a kind of colonialism that, you know, can really connect with some of the how it functioned in Canada, the ways that the church and the government kind of did that together. So we it's our responsibility to do this. And of course, you know, leaving aside, so much evil is done in the name of that. So this can be a really challenging piece when we think about how theology has sometimes contributed to a distortion, I would say, of what true hope can be. This is a quote that when I was last night, I was speaking with someone. I don't know if you're here tonight. Oh, you are, yes. Hope, this is with Václav Havel. So he wants to make, this is moving toward more positive constructions of hope. Hope is not the same thing as optimism. So he wants to disconnect those two, right? It is not the conviction that something will turn out well, but rather the certainty that something is worth doing regardless of how it turns out. This hope gives us strength to live and continually to try new things, even in conditions that seem as hopeless as ours do here and now. And he was writing that many years ago now, but it's still very true today. And then I was listening to a podcast with Jane Goodall and Robin Wall Kimmerer. Hope is learned from plants and the stories of indigenous knowledge. So different takes on hope altogether. But biblical hope, I think, is key here. Biblical hope always acknowledges threat and loss, while also nourishing a posture of trust. So often we see in understandings of biblical hope is honest about what is. It's not about lying about the future getting better. It's not about changing, being rescued and going to the sky or another earth somewhere, right? It's being honest about what is. And then also leaning into the possibilities that can emerge in being present to what is. Be strong and take heart, all you who hope in God. You are my refuge and my shield. I put my hope in your word. But as for me, I watch and hope for God. I wait for God. There's a sense of trust, which we talked about last night, this sense of this posture of trust and openness and honesty about what is. So again, which can, in our context, really require a certain amount of courage. So, parsing out what habits toward hope might look like for us at our time, I'm going to be drawing on theology and ideas from trauma recovery and then from post-traumatic growth, and sort of mapping these together to have offer some ways for us to consider living in hope, in a posture of hope, and leaning into habits toward hope. So these are the three areas. Very much, I see all of these as kind of a spiritual invitation, and I was talking with a couple of you last night that there's something about an inner transformation that needs to happen, in some sense, away from the sense of ourselves as consumers to becoming, God's own creatures, right? So there's a spiritual invitation that's very much an internal journey as well as this, and we were talking about that last night, as well as these actions, right? But it definitely has that inward movement. So the trauma recovery threefold process, Judith Herman, who wrote her wonderful book on trauma and recovery, is often quoted for this threefold process. So the first piece is establishing safety. So when we're in a kind of context of a lot of triggers or a lot of threats that can overwhelm us, we can easily fall into these trauma responses like we talked about last night. So establishing safety is key. Then acknowledging losses is the next part of the process. And then this reconnecting with life. So I'm using these three as kind of a way of mapping out these habits of hope tonight. And I'm drawing on, some key leaders who have been working in climate kind of activism and in living in eco villages, doing some really creative, interesting things for many decades. And some of the practices that they talk about, I have this Jane Goodall book here, who I've got a couple of quotes to share with you. Okay, so let's start with first one, habits toward hope, establishing safety. So I'm proposing that establishing safety has to do with, in some sense, discovering our home again in the earth, by reconnecting with the earth. We're coming in a situation, again, what we talked about last night, this alienation from our connectedness with the earth, the disconnection that's been happening. How do we reconnect and discover a sense of safety in and with the earth? So spiritual practices within community and the community of creation, within communities of human creatures, support a sense of safety, of being held within a much larger organic whole. And I'm suggesting here gratitude is one practice. We'll pop into that a little bit more. Experiences of awe and reverence and joy, and also humility and a curiosity to learn from the earth. This isn't a kind of easy, happy kind of hope, but it's one that's forged each day, right, by these practices. And again, with Jane Goodall, Christiana Figueres, as well as Robin Wall Kimmerer, providing a real help for thinking through what this might look like and feel like each day. So gratitude. So gratitude as a practice feeds hope. It's also the starting point for all worship, really. I mean, gratitude is the starting point, liturgy of worship. Gratitude for life that is not of our making. The big thing, I think, in our consumer capitalist culture that gratitude really resists is this idea that we have to be consumers and we need more and more and more. What gratitude does is it enables a sense of this sacred abundance rather than depletion and threat. It sort of honors that and builds out of that. There's not the room for the greed that drives consumption when gratitude is a key practice and a kind of starting point. So I just invite us to think about that, our own individual and communal kind of practices of gratitude. Entering each day in a posture of gratitude for the gracious gift of life and breath given freely each moment. The sense of breath given from the trees. I mean, the sort of cleaning of the air that happens all around us from the function of the trees in our midst. Gratitude in undermining the greed of consumption. It's exactly that greed that is wounding the earth. So there's something quite radical and so true about a starting point of gratitude, which resists the kind of dominant order. And so how might gratitude be one of those practices that can help us, again, find our home, reconnect with the earth, and also resist some of the systems and ways of being and ways of thinking that drive that kind of neoliberal capitalist order that is so depleting the earth. Another habit toward hope. Jane Goodall describes that each day she needs to experience something of awe and reverence and joy in creation, right? And again, we see this in the scriptures, we see this all over the place, this sense of joy in creation and the sense of creation alive in joy with being, together in the community of creation. Experiences of awe, reverence, and joy feed hope. I'm drawing again on this theme that we discussed a bit last night as mirrors reflecting back the divine love imbued in creation. Awe and reverence and joy honor God's deepest delight, seeing all that God had made, and it was very good. Again, enabling humans to rediscover our place in creation. This sense of home, this sense of awe, and how these experiences of awe, reverence, and joy can feed us and feed hope. Even as humans continue our destructive ways, the earth seeks restoration, always leaning toward life. Green shoots spring forth after devastating fires. Flowers emerge from winter soil, robins lay bright blue eggs, and otters play and frolic. I invite you to consider your own places, those places in your memory, in your mind that take you to that space of awe, of reverence, of joy. There's a quote. Even a wounded world is feeding us. Even a wounded world holds us, giving us moments of wonder and joy. I choose joy over despair, not because I have my head in the sand, but because joy is what the earth gives me daily, and I must return the gift. Robin Wall Kimmerer, Indigenous scientist, botanist, whose book, Braiding Sweetgrass, has been so influential in so many people's thinking. And then a habit toward hope. humility and a curiosity to learn and to learn from creation. So this is a great quote that actually my son found it in Job and painted it for me, and I have it on my wall. And it's a part where Job is responding to some of what his friends have said. But ask the animals and they will teach you, the birds of the air and they will tell you, ask the plants of the earth and they will teach you, and the fish of the sea will declare to you. So there's something so important. If we can learn from the creatures, this sense of learning from other creatures, and have a curiosity and openness to learn about what it means to be earth creatures from other creatures that we inhabit this earth with. There's something very powerful about that. And in the scriptures, there's actually so much. I don't know if any of you have the green Bible, but it has all these little parts that are in green. And there's so much there too about the agency of the earth. So Robin Wall Kimmerer uses the language of we are the younger siblings. Humans are the youngest siblings. They're the youngest siblings in creation. All our creaturely siblings have been around for so much longer on this planet than humans have been. And she describes that there's so much we can learn from them. We are formed after all other creatures. And our sibling creatures have lived through all sorts of changes. So it's just it's a different perspective. It's a way of, again, paying attention, being open and curious. And to do this, you actually need that kind of humility to be open to be taught. You know, humility comes from the word humus, which is of the earth. This is an example that Jane Goodall shares. These peace trees that survived the atomic bomb. You can see on the left is after the atomic bomb hit Nagasaki. And amazingly, these trees survived. I'm just going to read you the little part from the book. In 1991, she wrote, I visited Nagasaki, a city where the second atomic bomb was dropped at the end of World War II. My host showed me photos of the absolute and horrifying devastation of the city and the fireball that was produced by the nuclear explosion. Scientists predicted that nothing would grow for decades and that nothing had survived. But amazingly, 2 500-year-old camphor trees had survived. Only the lower half of their trunks remained after the bomb. And from that, most of the branches had been torn off. Not a single leaf remained on the mutilated trees, but they were alive. I was taken to see one of the survivor trees. It's now a large tree, but its thick trunk has cracks and fissures, and you can see it's all black inside. But every spring, that tree puts out new leaves. Many Japanese regard it as a holy monument to peace and survival, and prayers written in tiny kanji characters on parchment have been hung from the branches in memory of all those who had died. I stood there, humbled by the devastation we humans can cause and the unbelievable resilience of nature. And so she's really drawing on some of the stories of trees and other plant life. And in this case, really a kind of trauma recovery story, this sort of sense of resilience and hope, and even the idea of this survival can itself feed a sense of hope. So these are the practices I want to sort of weave together when we think about this, when I'm mapping it out, sort of safety and finding home and reconnecting with the earth, this sort of gratitude, reverence, joy, awe, curiosity to learn from the earth, and openness to learn. Now I'd like to move to the second point, which is around the habit toward hope, lament and mourning. So, and in trauma recoveries, there's a sense of safety, but then this movement then to be able to lament and mourn what is lost, that is so important. And we know in the scriptures, the lament in the scriptures very much speaks to this. So we see it in trauma theory, we see it in the scriptures, invites us to turn to our losses, to express the fullness of love in absence, to honor life and meaning. So when we actually grieve, when we lament loss, it's a way of honoring, it's a way of expressing love. There's a whole bunch of ways that it honors love and the preciousness of life and the meaningfulness of life lived, and to acknowledge the precious gift of life in all its particularity and uniqueness. So in the context of the sixth extinction, acknowledging loss through practices of lament and mourning reflect love and, typo there, sorry, and therefore lean toward hope. So I think especially in our context where being happy can be like a goal and it can be the thing we're supposed to strive for, it's very easy for us to not want to turn to lament. We don't want, like, it feels scary. And sometimes it can feel scary because it's just going to swallow us up. However, it's really only that when we turn toward those experiences, when we turn toward loss and acknowledge loss for what it is, you know, that space can be opened up for something else, right? For love to be expressed in its fullness, even in absence. So turning toward our losses as a way to honor life, giving space and intentionality to communal remembering, mourning of beloved, in this case, habitats and species and ways of life. I think this, for us today, is a really important way of honoring and acknowledging the losses that already have taken place and are taking place. In the Psalms of Lament, they reflect this process of communal acknowledgement and mourning, and which is so much a part of faithfulness in this earthly realm. It can feel fearful, you know, because grief can just feel so overwhelming. We can feel fearful of its vastness, and we can sort of clamp down, but then it keeps us from experiencing the love and the compassion that's all hidden within the grief and is a part of the grief. So mourning is such an important way of expressing love, honoring love and meaning, and it's a way of, because it's about love, ultimately, then it is generative. It leans toward that generativity because it's coming out of that space of love. In that sense of where love is, God is also. So there's something that opens there and can open. And I want to share in particular a little story about Ashley Consolo. She's an eco-grief researcher, Canadian eco-grief researcher. She now teaches in Newfoundland. And she was doing research for her dissertation, and she was up in Labrador, and I'll share what happened there. So she basically she was hearing all these stories of despair. She was interviewing Innu elders up there, and learning about the stories of the land that had been lost and the ice. And so it was Inuit in the north and then Innu lower down. And she was trying to write them up for her dissertation when she began experiencing radiating nerve pain in her arms and hands. The pain was so severe that she couldn't type or work. She went to all the medical specialists she could, but they could find nothing wrong with her nerves. And finally, she went to one of the Inuit elders, and he told her, "You're not letting go of your grief. Your body is stopping you from typing because you're intellectualizing it and you're not feeling it. Until you get it out of your body won't function," he said. And so he told her she had to make space for her grief and speak it. And she also had to find awe and joy every day. So both and this Inuit elder recommended. So what did she do? She went to the forest. She immersed her hands in an ice-cold river. She asked the water to take away the pain. She apologized to the land for the harm that she and others were doing. It was a kind of reckoning, she described. And then she also said during that time, and it was about two or 3 weeks that this process went on, or 2 weeks, I think. She said that she also was able to find awe and joy in the forest through that time. She said there's always beauty, even when there's pain and suffering. So she learned not to hide from the darkness and not to get lost in it. After 2 weeks, it was of crying, of letting go of the grief and letting it flow out of her body, the nerve pain was gone. And after that experience of that ecological grief and the reality of that so many are feeling, became the primary focus of her research. A really powerful story in terms of the importance of releasing and naming it. So it is something I think about for faith communities. How do we, even for ourselves, it may be that others don't want to join, but there might be some of us who need it. How can faith communities create spaces for acknowledging and lamenting eco-losses? There's a wonderful organization, the BTS Center, that's online, that has started eco chaplaincy, and they have eco grief groups meeting online weekly through the year. Sharing circles to talk about the elephant in the room, so to speak, to acknowledge and normalize the pain and the sadness there, to release it and to share the sadness. When we share experiences of lament, this always leans towards hope and resilience, honoring the pain for what it is, and the love and the beauty hidden within that. And then the final stage or way of mapping on these habits of hope are to reconnect to life through engaged action. So again, in trauma theory, that's the reconnecting with life is part of the sort of recovery model, and it tends to be a sort of cyclical recovery. So we talked a bit about this last night, directing the energy of eco-anxiety or climate trauma toward life so that we can be honest about that. Action with and for the earth can feed hope. And the idea that in actually embodying that and engaging at that level feeds us, because as I described last night, there's a sense in which our physiology is affected by getting our hands mucky, right? I shared the quote last night about oxytocin, the love hormone, is released when we when humans smell humus, the soil, right? So there's something very important about reconnecting with the earth, both for the earth's care, but also for our care. Getting our hands dirty, moving our bodies in outdoor spaces feeds spiritual and mental well-being and opens larger horizons of hope and meaning. And a small example of this, I don't know if you've ever felt this, but sometimes if I just home in my space, my home, right, and I can stay there, and it's like, life feels so small and narrow if I'm there for so long, and there's something that can happen, and this is just a little example, but going outside and the lifting of the sky and the vastness of the sky and how that can just shift everything in my experience of being closed down. So how can we engage in some of these actions in and for the world? Engaging in action for and with the earth honors our vocation as earth keepers and tenders. And learning about the restorative energies of the earth, as well as working with the restorative energies of the earth. I'm going to show you a picture in a few minutes of a tree at ground zero that was almost completely died in 9/11, the survivor tree. And there was somebody who found it with a few branches there and tended it and worked with the restorative energy of that tree, and now it's a blossoming big tree again. But how do we learn about that and work with the restorative energies of the earth that would feed us and the earth to be tenders and keepers? And, there are all sorts of actions. I'm sure many of you are involved in some of these kind of actions, but thinking about faith communities, how engaged action for the earth can be part of who we are. What are the kinds of things that we're already doing? I think about, there was a food bank that the local churches in my neighborhood have had for many, many years, and not too long ago, we were able to get land from the city and build and plant a community garden, which so the clients and the guests can come and they can, work in the garden and then harvest the food there. There's something wonderful about that, and learning together about how to plant the gardens. I'm sure some of you are doing some of those kinds of creative kinds of things, but how that can be part of who we are as church. And of course, there's advocacy and policy and all these other ways that are so important. But that idea of re-engaging with life, which is that third part of trauma recovery, how that can sort of hold within it all sorts of practices towards hope, where we're even if the world were to end tomorrow, we're planting our tree today, as we ended the presentation with yesterday. So eco-anxiety and habits of hope. So it can feel easier to stay locked in the cycles of avoidance and distraction like we talked about last night, or a manic effort to fix things, which usually only makes things worse. But habits of hope can draw us beyond that trauma cycle, to reclaim our embodied earthenness as creatures intricately woven in the depths of the earth, to acknowledge the precious gift of life and love, especially in its absence and loss, and to give ourselves to God's holy work in creation, whatever the outcome. And this is this tree I just mentioned to you that was in at ground zero tree that now has been a sort of example of humans and nature, sort of this working, how the keeping and tending of the earth, right? When we can understand the restorative energies that are in the earth, what keeping and tending can actually look like. And again, these are, these kind of symbols, like you mentioned before, these symbols of kindness, all these kinds of symbols can be such important symbols of hope for us in these times, and learnings for us in these times. And I close again with my favorite quote, because whether or not Martin Luther said it, because it so fully captures this sense of trusting, being present, being honest, and loving anyway, and acting anyway, and holding up the preciousness of life anyway. So I leave you with that. Thank you very much. Any questions or thoughts or things?
Excellent. We're going to use the mics so the folks at home can hear us.
Thank you very much. I really enjoyed it, especially. I was connecting your comments on lament with a question from the end of last night's lecture, where somebody compared the efforts being made by people in underdeveloped countries and the fact that eco-grief really belongs to, as I think they put it, white people in the first world.
Yeah.
And I was wondering about guilt, because I didn't hear you mention guilt, but I guess it's under lament. And I believe
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know what you think about this, but to my mind, the equal grief that we would experience in the West, so-called West or North, is riven with this grief of guilt.
Right.
Because it's the grief of those who are responsible against the grief of those who are oppressed for some other reason. So when I heard you mention lament, I thought perhaps it's worthwhile.
Thank you for that. I think that's guilt. I think also moral injury, you know, this idea of moral injury, of being a part of something where there's guilt. Guilt is a part of it, right? It's this sense of being complicit in this and carrying the guilt of that and how hard that is. Yeah. Interesting. As you're speaking, I mean, it strikes me that even liturgical acknowledgements of that and ways of confession, right, around some of that, that there's something that needs to be said there, because when we talk about the sort of systems of the sort of neoliberal capitalist order that benefit some and you know, oppress many others, some of us benefit or learn how to benefit from that more than others, or because of the color of our skin or where we're born or whatever. Yeah, so what does that mean for us? I mean, I think it's a hugely important question. I think we I mean, I ask different questions in my location, you know, we ask different questions. I think liturgical, confessional, depending, you know, practices as a part of a lament, I mean, I think could be very powerful kinds of interventions. Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that.
Less a question than a comment regarding your comment about liturgical practices. At the end of COVID, after 2 years, I'm minister of a downtown church in our nation's capital of Ottawa.
Oh, right.
And at the end of COVID, and having survived occupation by convoy horses, I held the week before Thanksgiving a service of lament, followed by a service of Thanksgiving.
Wow.
And it was a service rich with readings from Job and from Lamentations and prayer of confession geared towards what we had lost in COVID.
Right.
And the follow-up to this is just after the service, I was talking with someone who was walking by on the street one morning on her way to work, and we're talking about the convoy of COVID, and I mentioned the service of lament, and her response was a little simplistic, but I think there's a kernel of truth in it. She said, "It's too bad those convoy people wouldn't have heard about this. Maybe they wouldn't have needed to come in the convoy." How we give opportunities to give that lament, I think is so important.
Yeah. Thank you for that example. Do you do that every year prior to Thanksgiving?
I
It was just after the.
I just did it
Just after
at the end of
COVID.
COVID. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, powerful. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Because it's interesting, because it can't, you know, having that, those kinds of liturgical honoring, you know, brings it forth in a way and can allow people in a safer way to touch into that, as opposed to sort of sharing groups that would be further along, right? It's sort of, it's the beginning of acknowledging it publicly and collectively. Yeah, yeah, that's very powerful.
Just to continue along that theme, I worked for 39 years in long-term care, just very recently retired. And I was there in the midst of COVID. I think ecological grief and reconnecting with life, I'm not sure there's any choice but to have hope. In crisis, in trauma and crisis begets hope and community.
What's that?
Trauma and crisis, I think, begets hope. Because in the first year of COVID, in my work community, we lost 110 clients and some staff. And we were in the trenches. And if you're in the trenches, you have to have hope. It changes you. and it changes your mind. That's my thought on that. Thank you so much for your comments.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, painful.
Hi, thank you. I serve in a community that lost 150 homes due to the wildfires a couple of years ago. And it's been really interesting that the less said, the better for many of those who experienced the trauma. And I take their lead as to whether they want to talk or not.
Right.
And they often will, but they'll go long periods of time when it doesn't come out.
Right.
And it's pretty recent. And it seems to me that there's not a pretense. It doesn't seem to me that there's denial or avoidance. It seems it is so close.
Yeah. Right.
And all the associated trauma around not being back in homes again. So it's just kind of interesting to me that there's a quiet dignity that does not appear to be a false, happy, everything's fine, let's get on with it.
Right.
There appears to be a bit of, perhaps people are a hint solemn. And so I think in 2 years, the dust is settling. So if I were to suggest a sharing circle, I think people would say not a chance in.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
However, one-on-one.
Yeah.
It comes up from time to time. So there's almost a quiet, solemn dignity that this is a precious experience and a traumatic experience. And we just don't go about talking about it every day.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, that's really, really important. It's interesting because it's also the communities and the context you're imagining. And so exactly what you say. I mean, there's a sense in which just to survive, it's like, it's there. We don't need to be talking about it. Let's just, and it's also others. There's a whole community that has suffered together, right? And in different ways, it affects people a bit differently, but there is something, and it's sort of an unwritten, unspoken kind of reality that they know. And so that to me, the one-on-ones and it's sort of as it's able to come forth, really resonates. And some people are going to respond differently. For some, it's not going to be a traumatic thing in that same way, right? A lot of people don't. They continue functioning in different ways and sort of draw on different coping resources. I realized when I was, that sort of the sharing circles has really been something for youth and young adults who are really struggling with this and feel frustrated about my generation, our generation, right? And sort of a place to release some of that. So thinking about all of these different kinds of ways that lament or the grief can be held even in unspoken ways as well. I do wonder about liturgically or as a church if there might be at some time there might be something that comes as a possibility.
So one of the things that was fascinating was that we hired a musician to have a concert to recognize the situation, and the music was fabulous, and everyone visited, and first responders were there, and so it was very clear why we were doing it, but we didn't over-focus on it, and that seemed to work.
Right, and the music having that way of not having to bring it to voice in words, but it brings it forth in other ways and honors it. Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you.
Do you know the work of Jan Barber?
Yes, I haven't read it recently, but yes.
I think you not you, but you were everybody needs to read the work again.
Yeah.
Jan Barber had, I think what she was in one of the other, he had a PhD in chemistry, the University of Chicago,
Right,
and he had a PhD in theology from Yale University.
right.
Two PhDs from the highest schools in that. So he was equally literate in science
Mhm.
and in theology, and it's very difficult to find that. It's good to have all the poetry, the feelings, nature on it. There's also some very practical questions we have to confront in this world.
Oh, for
And
sure.
people in the theological, have not done, nobody has followed up this work properly, in my opinion. Although maybe certain places, but not widespread, but every whoever is a scientist in the community who research that, they need to have theological people talking to that person, educating them to the issues, bringing some things to those people
Right.
there in the midst of things like that. And we need to be literate about science also.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's some really good conversations going on between, in certain pockets between science and theology, and some, I mean, the Yale Center for Religion and Ecology is a place where a lot of that kind of conversation is happening, which is good to see. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. All right. I'm going to draw our evening to a close with another word of thanks to Dr. McCarroll. You have blessed us with sharing your research, sharing your experience, sharing your wisdom, and we are just very, very grateful. I know some of the things you have said in the notes I have been taking, I will be praying with and sitting with and meditating on for quite a long time. So thank you. God bless.
Thanks so much.
And thank you all for being with us. Go with God.
I